So how did we find our first customer? This is a question I get asked all the time as a founder. The backstory. Today, Hightouch, has hundreds of customers. We've raised almost $100 million. But let's zoom back to the humble beginnings of the company. In the early days of Hightouch, it was really 3 friends working out of one room, which was actually my bedroom in this 10-person hacker house sort of setup in San Francisco. And at that time, we really had nothing. We had 3 desks in a room. We'd get up every day, grind on taking all these customer calls and trying to figure out what's something we could possibly build that would actually be able to get customers and create a hyper-scaling, hyper-growth startup. So the story behind our first customer was probably more luck than skill or strategy, but I'll tell it anyways, and then we'll dive into some tips that helped us find the next 20 customers or 100 customers. So in the early days of our first ever integration that we built on the reverse ETL platform was actually Slack. We had a plan to build more and more integrations, and we were totally going to do so. But Slack was the first integration we built because it would just be useful for us internally as a company, and we knew it was something that almost every company would use. So the idea was simple. You could put a SQL query into the Hightouch app, and you could say that when the results of this query change, for example, the query could be looking for a list of customers that's at risk in your data warehouse, or people who haven't logged in for a while, people who are using the product too much and owe you more money. Whenever a row changed that query, like a new row was added or a row dropped off, you could actually fire custom Slack alerts into any sort of channel in your Slack workspace, which is like an internal messaging tool. And the way that we got the first customer was actually just sharing this tool that we built in the internal YC alumni community. We were a part of this program called Y Combinator, and they have basically our startup incubator for aspiring founders and teams of founders. And after the batch completes, there's still a forum and a community online that a lot of people can post stuff on internally. So we just shared that we had this tool to send Slack notifications from your database with just a SQL query and some settings. And a random company that we never interacted with in Brazil actually reached out to us and ended up being our first ever customer. And it wasn't a lot of money. It was a $50 a month contract actually. It was a 1-call close as well. One of my co-founders and now our CTO, Josh, was on a call with them. They were interested in using this Slack notification tool, and they asked how much it cost, and on the spot, because we never discussed it, just made up a number of $50 a month and sold it to that customer. After Josh told us we closed our first customer, Kashish and I were pretty happy until he mentioned the price of $50 a month. And at that point we were like, split 3-way, that's not a lot of money. In the really early days of finding product market fit and of getting customers for your startup, you don't need to over optimize around things like pricing. You really just want to get some usage and learn from your early customers and just their willingness to pay anything. So I would say a few things really stuck out in terms of getting our first 10 or 20 customers at Hightouch. First is just this idea of looking for where your customers already are. So really knowing the persona or the audience you're going after and figuring out where they live today. As an example, in the early days of Hightouch, we were really focusing on data teams at the very beginning of Hightouch. Now Hightouch is used by data teams, marketing teams, business operation teams, all sorts of teams. But in the early days, we needed to narrow down our focus and find a customer that was really going to get Hightouch quickly. And that was data teams who could write SQL, but didn't want to build all these integrations to get data from their data warehouse that they could query in SQL to all these different SaaS tools in a company like Salesforce or Facebook ads or Marketo or Braze or whatever it was. And in terms of how we went out to find these customers and get conversations with them was first and foremost just looking for where our customers live today. Now, this isn't a repeatable tactic for every single company, but for us, what we found was there were some pretty prominent Slack communities that were actually blowing up within the data space. At the time, they had only hundreds or a couple thousand people in these communities, but now some of these communities actually have tens of thousands of folks. So they were actually exploding. So these Slack communities for us were things like DBT Slack. When we first started participating in the Slack community, we didn't have an official partnership with that company at all. It was just, we knew the users of DBT would be interested in Hightouch just from our knowledge of the data space. The other community was called Locally Optimistic, which was just another kind of unofficial community of data people that I think originally started in New York, but started to spread over Slack. The kind of tactics that we would take to find customers in these communities was first, we would just use the heck out of Slack search. So we'd Command F and search for all these keywords like Salesforce, API, all these things that might indicate that someone might be interested in something that we're offering or building at Hightouch. We'd search for these broad keywords, and maybe like 10% of those posts, so 1 in every 10 posts, would have something that was someone being like, hey, is there a tool to do this? Which was exactly what we were building at Hightouch and part of our customer discovery exercise as well. In addition to just reaching out to people who have explicitly expressed that they have a certain problem, you can do other crazy things like, scraping a list of customers from these Slack communities. May or may not be against their policies, depending on the communities. I think things have really tightened up over the last 3 or 4 years, but you can do things like that and reach out to everyone in these communities and see if they'd be interested in a feedback call. That was something that we found to be really repeatable in terms of getting early customers. A lot of people didn't want to be sold to, but were open to feedback, which was something we were actually interested in as founders as well, since you don't really know that your product has product market fit, frankly, until you have a higher number of customers. And the other thing that we did in these communities, other than reaching out to people directly, is just participating in them. We would share like cool blog posts about how we used our product for a use case. We would share cool like data tricks and slip in like a Hightouch use case into there, and just really participating in the communities as much as possible. So that's tip number 1, I would say, is just looking for where your customers are. The second tip that I would say was really, really helpful in the early days of Hightouch in terms of finding our first handful of customers, that I can't stress enough, honestly, is just leveraging your network. Everyone has some sort of network. Personally, from your school, distant relatives, people you meet in these Slack communities. You have some network and you're always developing it as a startup founder. What I would really emphasize is just looking everywhere you can to find someone who might be able to use your product, but also might know someone who might be able to use or give you good feedback on your product. I would reach out to people who were working at startups in sales roles or finance roles, or really any role at the company. I didn't care what role they worked at the company, because I wanted to get access to their network, so my second degree network, and ask them if they could intro me to the data person or to the operations person at their company. There's this trick that we sort of came up with through all our customer discovery calls and initial sales conversations that I sometimes call like the domino effect when you're trying to find your early customers, which is every single customer we would talk to for feedback, we would actually ask them, hey, are there 1 or 2 other people in your network that you'd recommend we speak to get more feedback and thoughts and perspective on what we're building at Hightouch? More often than not, any person in a data role would probably know 1 other person in a similar role and be willing to connect us. If you do that on every call, you can start getting into a rhythm where you have 5-10 calls a day coming from a background where you don't actually know any of these people, or you haven't even worked in the space before. The last tactic is LinkedIn automation. We found that outbounding folks on email was pretty hard to get really high response rates in the early days of Hightouch, but connecting with our personas that we were going after, like data and marketing technology, on LinkedIn was just a heck of a lot easier. And we would leverage little scripts and Chrome extensions, like Linked Helper is one of them, but there's other ones online, to basically connect with 50 people a day on LinkedIn and just try to have feedback conversations with them about what we were building at Hightouch. We would send a simple message like, hey, looking for feedback on what we're building. It's a product on the intersection of data and marketing. And I think that tactic is also especially important because it gets you out of the network, gets you out of your bubble. That's actually a tactic that we use to start having conversations with pretty large companies and traditional companies. So all in all, your mileage may vary with these tactics. For example, LinkedIn's probably changed its policies and become easier or harder in other ways to automate. Or, your audience, there may not be as many online communities. You might need to go to in-person communities or door-to-door or outside people's offices. The main reason startups fail is honestly just people giving up, like the founders giving up and not having the patience to keep trying and iterating on new things. And I think that, combined with some creativity and hustle, is really the formula for finding your early customers and hitting something that works. And when it comes to things like charging for your product, don't over-optimize in the super early days. Charging something is a good indicator that there's probably more money here. As you get to your 5th or 6th customer, you might need to start optimizing and seeing what the willingness to pay is to inform how you build your business. But just charging something and getting the customer learnings and feedback is what I would optimize for in the early days.